Welcome everybody to this off-the-shelf session with author Tessa Leuwsha and translator David McKay. We're very pleased to have you here. In this session, we will explore the Dutch colonial legacy in history and in stories, and we'll talk about translation and what that means for an international audience in the 21st century. My name is Tessa Leuwsha. I work in the School for Languages and Cultures at the University of Sheffield, and I'm dialing in from Sheffield. Tessa is on her phone from Suriname, from Suriname Paramaribo, and David is ringing in from The Hague. Welcome to the two of you. Let me introduce Tessa first. Tessa is a novelist, she is a journalist, she is a documentary maker. She was born in Amsterdam, but she moved to Suriname when she was in her late 20s. I want to show you her. This is the novel she published in 2020, Plantation Wildlust, which is a wonderful novel in which she explores the relationship between people, between different groups living on a Surinamese plantation in the early 20th century. And the film rights have been bought. So we are looking forward to the film too. She is currently working on a documentary, and that documentary is partly based on another of her books, Fancy Stilte, so Fancy Silence, which is based on her grandmother's life and experience. So welcome, Tessa. It's great to have you. And I'll go to David. David McKay is originally from the United States, but he has lived in the Netherlands for a very, very long time. I'm proud to say he is one of our best translators from Dutch into English, and that is recognized on all sorts of levels. For example, through the Vondel Prize, which he won for his translation of the novel War and Turpentine, Stefan Hetman's historical novel. Together with Ina Rielke, he tackled the translation of what is probably widely seen as the most significant novel for Dutch literature, namely Multatulis Max Havelaar. And recently he has translated another colonial book, namely Wij slaven van Suriname, We Slaves of Suriname, which is written by Anton de Kom in 1934. And it is about the history of Suriname from a Surinamese point of view. And interestingly, Tessa provided one of the opening essays. So we've got plenty of connection here. Welcome, David, as well. Shall we start with you, Tessa? Tessa, I think it'd be really useful if you explained to our viewers something about the history of Suriname.
Well, yes. Well, thank you for the introduction, Henriette. The history of Suriname. So Suriname used to be a colony of the Netherlands, of course, and it started. The country was founded actually by rich merchants in the Netherlands, and also the city of Amsterdam took part in it. And it was seen as an investment. The whole country was seen as a company, in fact, a plantation company. And plantation owners grew crops there like cotton and cacao and coffee with the use of enslaved people. And after the abolishment of slavery, they brought contract laborers in. So the whole concept of the country was one of exploitation, in fact, as merchandise, a way to gain money. Well, I think that's in a nutshell the history of Suriname.
It gained independence in 1975. Would you say the relationship between Suriname and the Netherlands is still a close one? Is it a warm relationship? Can you say something about the relationship between the Netherlands and Suriname?
For a colony that is quite recently gained independence, the connection, the ties between the Netherlands and Suriname are still very evident. On a political level, there's a lot of communication and a lot of contact, but also on a social level, there are a lot of people living in the Netherlands who migrated from Suriname. There are a lot of people studying in the Netherlands. You know, we share the same language, which is in fact very strange because it's the only Dutch-speaking country on the South American continent. So there are a lot of ties, and especially in Suriname, you feel the connection still very much with the Netherlands. We have the daily news from the Netherlands broadcasted from television, so we always know that whether it's snowing or raining in the Netherlands, you know, and all, yeah, it's kind of ridiculous actually, but all kinds of connections still are very alive today, reminding us from the past. Yeah.
And you decided to move to Suriname in your late 20s. Can you say something about that? Because it's usually the other way around, I believe.
Yeah, it's usually the other way around. My father migrated to the Netherlands in the 1960s. I was born and raised in Amsterdam. I have a white mother, a black Surinamese father. And, you know, growing up in Amsterdam, I knew hardly anything about my father's background, which was amazing, of course, because he was part of the household, part of the family. And in my 20s, I accepted an offer to write a travel guide about Suriname. And that's how I ended up, not for the first time, but for the second and for a longer period of time. And I was really fascinated about the country my father hardly told us anything about, because he was really trying to adapt to Dutch society, you know, which was expected of him in those days. So I was like, oh my God, this whole country that I'm part of and that forms my identity is still alive, and you know, bears the you know, the results of the colonial past. So I was really fascinated, and I was really I took it as a mission to write about Suriname and the connection with the Netherlands.
And when you say I took it on as a mission, that was if you started with a travel guide. But if we look through your other novels, then I think you're still working on your mission, aren't you? Can you? Because clearly that relationship, but also the country itself, is very much a backdrop of your writing. Can you say a little bit about that? How you explore those relationships?
Yeah, my first novel I started writing when my father died. You know, and I was shocked. Well, first of all, because he died too soon, but also because he took with him a story that I had never read before about migrants moving from Suriname because of economic reasons. He came from a poor background, being a descendant of enslaved people. And you know, it put me into action. I really wanted to write about that story of people who come to a new country, belong to the old country, and had to adjust to the Dutch way of life. But you know, the fact that he had to, when he lived in Suriname already, having to adapt to the Dutch way of living was something, you know, that really struck me. And I decided to explore all forms of, all aspects of the history, you know, and trying to look beyond the bigger picture and to see what connections there are, because this history is, we tend to see it as a very black and white history, which in fact it is. That's the big narrative. But there's so many nuances and so many gradations to this story, to this history. And I wanted to really dive into those stories and, you know, show my readers that this is a whole world, but it's very complex background.
I would like to pick you up on that a little bit later, particularly this not so black and white. But can I first go to you, David? David, you translated Wijslaar for Suriname, and I think it would be good if you told us something about the context of this book, the significance of this book.
Sure, I have some images to go with that as I tell you a little bit about Anton de Kom in the book, so I'll share my screen now. Okay, so one important thing to know about de Kom is that he's not only a Surinamese writer, but he was also a political activist, and he's seen as something of a hero by many people, both in Suriname and in the Netherlands today. The university there is named after him. There are statues, there are plaques dedicated to him in both of the two countries. So he came from a working class family struggling to get by in Paramaribo. He started out as a bookkeeper for the Dutch rubber company there, but his activist career actually started very early when he found out how the employees were being treated there. And he decided to try to educate them about their rights and organize them to demand better pay. But pretty soon he was dissatisfied with working as a bookkeeper, and he left Suriname in search of a more meaningful life. And in 1921, his search brought him to the Netherlands, where he took a variety of jobs to earn a living. He was probably the first Black man in the elite Hussar Cavalry Corps, as you see on the left there. He also worked for the post office for many years. He lived in The Hague, where I am now, with his Dutch wife and children, about a half a kilometer from where I'm sitting right now, for a long time. But his real passion was political activism. He wrote articles about Dutch colonialism, racism, and socialism for left-wing magazines, and he gave talks and lectures about colonial oppression in Suriname. In 1932, he went back to Suriname, and we see a picture of his wife and children on a ship here. But in fact, at the time he went back to Suriname, he went on his own. And he had become such a well-known political figure by then that a huge crowd of supporters gathered to see his ship come in. And when he began to talk to Surinamese workers about the oppression they faced, he was arrested without charges by the colonial administration there and held prisoner illegally for weeks. There was a demonstration demanding his release. It was broken up violently. At least one protester was shot dead and many others were injured. And he was sent back to the Netherlands in exile. 2 years later, in 1934, he published We Slaves of Suriname. And before I go on to the book, I just want to say later in his life, he became an active member of the resistance against the Nazi occupation as well. And he died in a German prisoner of war camp in 1945. So he was, and one last fact about de Kom himself is that he was recently added to the Dutch National Core Curriculum for History Education, the canon of the Netherlands, because of his central role in opposing racism and colonialism. So de Kom was passionate about poetry and literature, and you see that when you read his book, but he also saw his writing at least partly as a political tool and a teaching tool. He wanted to make Dutch readers aware of what had been done in Suriname, what was still going on there in the name of their country, so that they would stop supporting the colonial system. At the same time, he was also thinking about his Surinamese readers. For them, he wanted to create an inspiring national narrative of identity and solidarity. And his own well-known words are, no people can reach full maturity as long as it remains burdened with an inherited sense of inferiority. That is why this book, We Slaves of Suriname, endeavors to rouse the self-respect of the Surinamese people. And there's quite a debate about the genre of the book. Maybe I could say a little bit. Should I talk about that now or later?
Yes, please. Yes, so we'd like to know. Yes, please.
Okay, so there's an introductory section. There are 3 essays, and then 3 essays that follow that. And the opening pages are about the beauty and the majesty of the Surinamese landscapes. That sets the scene, and that keeps returning throughout the book. All the plants and animals. The book is full of images of the Surinamese landscape. And the first 2 essays are historical. The first is about colonialism and slavery, and the second is about the period after slavery. So in the first one, de Kom describes the horrors of slavery, let's see, I think I have. So we have some images of the Surinamese landscape here, a little map showing it's a country full of rivers with a very dense rainforest in the interior, and a very colorful bird life and other plant and animal life. And let's see, and I have, before I go on to the Maroons, let me just say, so the first essay describes the horrors of slavery, but what he really emphasizes in that essay is acts of resistance. He doesn't want to portray the enslaved people as victims, but as actors who are deciding their own fate. And he does that by making the Maroons central to the story. These are communities of people who had escaped from slavery and actually waged war against the colonists for centuries. And they're the heroes, really, of the whole book. The second essay about the post-slavery period is a little surprising because he talks about the other ethnic groups that have come to the country. Here we see some images of British Indians who were brought there as indentured laborers after slavery under false pretenses. Brought there and actually prevented from going home again. And the same is true of the Javanese who we see in the lower pictures there. And in that section too, he emphasizes acts of resistance, strikes, demonstrations. He talks about Gandhi's nonviolent resistance movement in British India. So that section brings the story up to the present, and it also draws a connection between the Maroons, those heroes, and puts these other ethnic groups in that same tradition of heroic resistance. And he finishes up with his own story of returning to Suriname. So the shift from a historical to a personal narrative suggests how to apply those lessons from history in the present, and also how that tradition might be carried forward into the future. Makes it more of a political narrative and not only a historical one. The book didn't make a huge splash in the Netherlands when it was first published.
No, it didn't, did it? Do you want to say something? Why you think it didn't?
He was very ahead of his time, and I think there was too much determination on the part of the Dutch to hold on to the colonial system, and they wouldn't. Yeah, you can see in the Netherlands he was being tracked by the Secret Service. You know, all kinds of opposition, all kinds of obstacles were put in his way. So I don't think it was time. I don't think they would have let it be time yet for that. If you see how fiercely they held on to the Dutch East Indies after the war too. I mean, the Dutch authorities were not nearly ready for this kind of thing. Yeah.
Can I just turn to Tessa at this point and ask her, do you, growing up in Amsterdam, when did you first hear about this book, and can you tell us something about whether or not it influenced your writing and your thinking?
Yeah, I heard about Anton de Kom. I think I was still in high school when I heard about him. And it was in a sort of a hush-hush way, you know, amongst other people of Surinamese descent. And I think I got hold of a copy of the book. It was actually when I had arrived in Suriname already, when I first read the book, and I found a copy in the book on the bookshelf of my aunt's house. And you know, I wasn't living then; I was visiting Suriname, but I was really amazed, and I was like, how didn't I know about this book earlier on, and how come, you know, this book hasn't reached a broader audience, because it's such an important book in various ways. Like David already stressed, you know, he really wanted to, you know, give Surinamese people self-pride by presenting them their heroes, but also by letting them know what's being done to them, even in the early 20th century until the Second War. And, you know, because people were sort of blinded by, you know, the circumstances they lived in. It was their reality. And people really tried to adopt the Dutch way of life and trying to transform them in themselves into a Dutch people, you know. So it was an important book for me, and it really was an eye-opener on very different levels.
When it was published in 1934, was it at all known in Suriname? Did it make any impact there, or are you not aware of what happened to the publication? Did it never? Well, of course, the Second World War broke out as well. I mean, is it in Suriname today an important book?
It is a very important book. It is, you know, as David said, the university is named after Anton de Kom. A street is named after him. So he's a very important figure. And it is, you know, Suriname quite recently is growing into a more independent identity. So quite recently, the book has been reinvented or rediscovered, actually, and presented to children in school and students, because it was kind of you know, a book that you could not talk about. And so, yeah, quite recently, the book has regained attention, and also because of developments in the Netherlands, translations going on now. So I'm very happy with that, you know, because I think Surinamese writers all stand on the shoulders of Anton de Kom, who was a pioneer, and he was his time way ahead, writing in the colonial days about the Dutch and their wrongdoings.
And would you say, sorry to interrupt you, Tessa, that he has influenced your writing? And you say I'm standing on his shoulders, but in what way? Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, but my latest novel, Plantation Wildlust, I really wanted to depict the world that Anton de Kom lived in, you know, those early 1920s, 1930s. I really wanted to show that world. And, you know, Anton de Kom gave us the bigger picture, the superstructure of the colony, the whites against the blacks. The other reality was that the racial society had a lot of gradations. And I wanted to show that. And I wanted to really present black characters, individual characters with strong personalities. I created a black overseer who is a mean person, you know, because I have to bring, to my opinion, I have to bring the work of Anton de Kom a little bit further, and not only show black people from their perspectives, but also humanize them. You know, he gave us back heroes, but I think the next step is to humanize black people and people of color, and also make them mean, because that's how people are. You know, people are mean and they're good and everything in between. And that's the next step I think we should embrace, and what I'm trying to do in my work.
Yes, I think it's fascinating how in that novel, in your last novel, you show that the white plantation owner is also very much caught in the position that he's granted in society, and that he wants to connect with other people, but the advice of keep your distance from the locals is something that he cannot move past, and it's wonderful. It's wonderful the way you do that. David, so you talk about there's 3 essays. Could you describe We Slaves of Suriname as an alternative history, as a counter history from what had been at the time written about Suriname? So can you say something about the type of book it is?
Yeah, I think it's a counter narrative. Yeah, and the facts weren't different from what white historians already knew, but de Kom brought those out to the public, made them public, and also made a narrative out of them in which you had the Maroons were the heroes of the narrative, and other groups were seen as following in their footsteps. So it's a particular, a politically motivated, I think, conception of what Surinamese history is, but also very true to the facts, the historical facts as they were understood at the time, and I think it holds up pretty well too. Yeah.
And you are translating the book about nearly a century later for a very different audience. What did that do to your what did that do to your translation? I mean, what was your strategy there? And can you give examples of how this, basically the passing of time, had an impact on how you approached this project?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and it took a lot of research just to find out, what is the context that he was working in, and to understand what his sources were, and also to understand that he was aiming the book at both of these two different audiences. I think that's a really central fact, both for for writing the book and for translating it, that it was being aimed at Dutch readers and at Surinamese readers at the same time. So in the translation, for example, I had to think about sometimes making one choice in the text, but then having some kind of paratext, something like a glossary that would support that for a different group of readers. So for example, de Kom uses a lot of Sranantongo words from the Surinamese Creole, Sranantongo, and he likes to make the text more colorful that way. Sometimes they're even recognizable as being derived from English words, so you can understand to some extent what they mean. And it makes it very much his own idiom. He's insisting on using the Dutch language in his own way, and speaking with his own voice. So putting himself outside the conventional discourse of white historians, or moving that forward. So I thought it was important to preserve that texture in the book. At the same time, I wanted to have some support for readers who just don't know what some of these words mean, don't know, maybe not even as much as the average Dutch reader would in some cases. So I do have a glossary in the back of the book where you can look and find out what these words mean. Yeah, that's one example of the kind of double approach. So trying to serve two audiences at once. Yeah,
it's interesting that you say when it was written, it was already aimed at two audiences. It was to inform the Dutch public, but also to empower the Surinamese readers. And you try to preserve that. That's very good. If you look at the title, did the title give you headaches?
No, I did think about it, but it seemed fairly clear to me that in that respect, at least, I mean, the issue here is that we wouldn't use the word slaves as easily these days. We would talk about enslaved people. And I felt that you have to sort of put de Kom in the context of the conceptual systems that he's operating in. You don't have to make it a total pastiche of 1934 language or anything like that. If he says, I don't have to say dentifrice instead of toothpaste or something like that. But I do need to translate key terms like slaves in a fairly literal way or in the way that his contemporaries in the English-speaking world would have used them too. I think, someone like C.L.R. James, another great Caribbean writer from just a few years later, would also have talked about slaves rather than enslaved people.
Yes, no, I can see that. And Tessa, to take it to you, because your novel is set in the 1910s, did you make allowances for a contemporary audience, if you like? What did you do to your language? I mean, were you aware of the fact that we have different sensitivities now from the way people probably talked in the 1910s?
Yes, I was. I studied letters of a Dutch family, a Dutch plantation owning family, and they gave me their whole set of letters and pictures, And the way people spoke then, it's just not appealing to a reader audience nowadays. So to me it was, you want to step into reality, and if you want to capture that, you need to use the words of the reality nowadays. And I made the decision to use both slaves and enslaved because I think both notions are very true. I mean, the word slave was used then to belittle Black people, but then again, we have embraced the word enslaved. So I really like to use both words to also show how the time is moving on, and I think that works. But you have to use nowadays language to really connect to the emotions of people in this time. Because otherwise you will read it and it's a faraway story. But I really wanted to connect it to our time, because the past has its influence in the present. Like I told in the beginning, Suriname is really still very connected to the Netherlands. So I wanted to glue these periods of time together, the past and the present. And to do that, I really needed to use language of today. In order to keep our readers, active and really present in the book.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And it works very well indeed. Now, this is a question to both of you, really, but I'll ask it first. I'll pose it first to David. What is going to change after the publication of your translation, to the fact that this Anton de Kom is now available for an international audience? Are you expecting this to make a difference? And what are you hoping?
I don't know what to expect. What I'm hoping is that it would then that he can then come into dialogue with people who wrote in other languages and wrote about similar issues, and people who are thinking about similar things today. I mean, you see, a very recent development is, for example, the New York Times has something they call the 1619 Project, which is reframing American history from a different point of view, talking about the 400th anniversary in 2019 of slavery, which began in the United States in 1619, and looking at history from that perspective. And that's very much the same kind of thing that Anton de Kom was doing, is thinking about, okay, what is the big narrative we should be looking at? How should we see the history of our country? And I think he has things to say about how you might do that. And I think some of the conceptual things he does in the book, for example, the way he has some nationalist ideas, but he also has very Marxist ideas, and he tries to reconcile those with each other. The way he sees sort of slavery as he rethinks Marxist and communist ideas, so that slavery is sort of central to them. That becomes the kind of prototypical form of the oppression of laborers, is slavery. So he does very interesting things, which I think are still new and interesting for people who will be reading the book. So it's not just of historical interest.
Is there evidence that de Kom was aware of what was happening in the United States at the time that he wrote it? Are there connections? Can you see connections? Did he?
Yeah, actually more to the United States than to other countries in the Caribbean. I think he was very aware of, and he was actually in correspondence with I forget who it was, but with a Black author in the United States about having the book translated into English at that stage too. He was very excited about that. So yeah, he was definitely following events there.
Was the book translated into other languages at the time?
There was a very early translation into German,
Right.
which did not get widely distributed outside of communist circles. And that was about it for a long time. And then now recently there's been a retranslation into German, which has already come out. So there's a new German translation, new German edition. There's the English translation, and it's I think already a couple other languages. I think Macedonian and Arabic are the other two.
Really?
Which there's now a translation planned.
Oh,
yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, but it's interesting how it's really gained a lot of traction recently, I think.
Yeah.
And Tessa, do you think this will connect the story of Suriname to other countries within the Caribbean or broader?
Yes, I think so. And, I think it might also explain more about the position of the Dutch, Dutch Empire. We never speak about Dutch Empire, but it really was, from the Dutch West Indies to New York in its early stage, to Brazil, to French Guyana bordering to Suriname, and Suriname and the Dutch Antilles. It was a Dutch Empire. And I think more, we could learn more about Dutch Empire and all its aspects. And a translation of the work of Anton de Kom could really add to that greatly and put Suriname on the map, because it's quite a forgotten country on the South American continent. So I really hope that more study can be done about Dutch Empire and how it connects to the British and French Empire, for instance, and see where these big stories come together. And I think it can be very interesting for a broad audience.
Yeah, and I think silence about the past, which is also very much a theme of your work. Do you feel that silence is being broken recently?
Yes, because my first novel came out in 2005. The novel about my father going to the Netherlands and having to adopt, but also while growing up in Suriname, needing to adapt to Dutch rule. That was 2005. And I felt like somebody shouting in the desert. I mean, this is going on, and why does nobody talk about it? It's quite recently that this subject is talked about and discussed about. I mean, just for the last 3 years, I guess. So that's only the beginning, I hope.
Yeah. And it's I find it interesting about your work that you take that silence to a very personal level, as in your grandmother, who does not talk about her experience, her past, your dad, your father not sharing his Surinamese background. I mean, how silence became a mode. Do you think that mode as in Suriname is also changing?
It's changing slowly. To me, that's very important, to connect history to personal experience, like Anton de Kom does in his work. He talks about his returning to the colony and his perspective, and our fathers and our mothers. That's his way of mentioning enslaved ancestors. So he already made history personal. And I think that's the only way to really feel the impact of this colonial history on individuals living in colonial societies and post-colonial societies. So that's a very important aspect of my work. And I think the silence, that's it's opening up a little bit more, but it's still not common for people to say, I'm a descendant of enslaved people. People would rather say, I descend from some kingdom in Africa. I'm a Nubian prince, for instance. In my own family, people say that, because the image of poverty and of being owned by another person is something shameful. It still is. So I really hope by the translation of Anton de Kom, these topics are not shameful anymore to talk about, and it's come perfectly natural, to talk about your heritage and the fact that you descend from enslaved people and from a colonial structure that oppressed our forefathers.
Yeah. Yes. I can see that. This is very poignant, really, what you're saying. David, you also translated or were involved in translation of the Max Havelaar, which looms so large in Dutch literature. Can you compare those two books or those two experiences?
It was one thing that helped me feel like I was a good person to be translating this book, de Kom's book, because you hear echoes of Multatuli in the style. You hear de Kom has many different styles, but one of them is this kind of rhetorical voice, this kind of cynical bitterness. There are moments of that in the book where you hear that kind of Multatulian voice. De Kom also has great enthusiasm and lyricism, which is not quite Multatuli, which is very much his own voice, and other voices, a kind of very plain directness, which is also very much his own. But he also commanded this register, this Multatulian voice, and the irony that goes with that, and the rhetoric that goes with that, and that's very audible in the book. And he does directly refer to Multatuli's work a couple times. Yeah.
Yes, he does do irony very clearly as well. It is. We warmly recommend everybody to pick it up. The book will be available from February 2022, I believe, from Polity Books. So do keep an eye out for that. Tessa's novel is, and you can read an extract from Tessa's novel Plantation Wildlust on either the website of thelowcountries.com or the Dutch Foundation for Literature website. And I also warmly recommend for you to have a look at that. And we'll look forward to either the English translation or the film. Can I, both of you, thank you very, very much for this conversation. I think we put a lot of flesh on some questions here. I'd like to thank Off the Shelf for organizing this session, New Dutch Writing, as well as the Foundation for Literature. Thank you very much.